Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're comparing 3 cool stories about strangers crossing a line. One starts with a man in his underwear on a lawn, another in a crowded airplane aisle, and the last in a theme park queue. Each is about what happens when a private moment becomes a public confrontation. Stick around until the end because we're going to compare all 3 and decide which one really delivered the best outcome. And I want you to vote in the comments on which story deserved the win. My security cameras captured a man in his underwear and a family crawling under my house. The explanation was not what I expected. This morning, I awoke to a bunch of notifications from my home surveillance system. Upon checking it, I see a middle-aged man in his underwear, no shirt, and flip-flops wandering throughout my partially fenced back and front yard, looking around everywhere, casing the place with a slightly panicked expression. It was extremely suspicious and unnerving. Since the notification was only 20 minutes prior, I shoot up out of bed, put on some clothes, and run outside in hopes of confronting the trespasser to tell them to leave my property. But I am unable to find any trace of anybody. It's a quiet morning out, and everything seems as usual. I go back in the house and look at the surveillance footage more closely, watch the other camera angles, etc., and am even more unnerved to see a whole family far away in the distance on one of the backyard cameras, a mom and a young daughter crawling underneath my wife and I's tiny house that we parked out behind our main house. The mom's holding a shovel and the daughter's holding a long stick. You can't see what they're doing. You can only see from their shoulders up, but they're crawling around underneath the tiny house. The wind was too strong for the camera to pick up audio of what they were doing. You could also see them looking over my other neighbor's fence too. It's also suspicious and creepy. What were they doing? Where did they disappear to? I showed my wife, and she thought they were trying to break the locks on the tiny house door. I went back outside to the tiny house and looked all over where the family was crawling around and couldn't find anything askew or missing, not even any footprints in the dirt. WTF. I text my immediate neighbor photos of the people, and they don't recognize them. They suggest I call the cops. Neighbors thank me for watching out for them. However, I don't like calling the cops, so I did the next best thing. Printed out a few flyers with a photo of the suspicious underwear man saying basically, watch out for this person in the neighborhood. He was with a woman and a young girl. I distributed the flyers and the neighbors who share the easement where the family emerged. I don't think much more of it, and the day continues. Tonight, I'm in the front yard doing yard work when a woman approaches me and tells me that she's my neighbor from 5 houses down. I've never seen or met her before. She says she doesn't appreciate that her neighbors now know what her husband in his underwear looks like, that obviously they were trying to retrieve some pet chickens that were attacked by a hawk. Why would anyone steal with their daughter with them? Why didn't I come out and confront them? She really let me have it. I apologized, tried to explain that I've never seen them before, that I was sleeping, couldn't see what they were doing, from my point of view how suspicious it all was, etc. But she wasn't having it. Told me her morning was terrible and that I made it worse, passively-aggressively told me to have a great night and stormed off. Her anger isn't just about the flyer, it's about the humiliation of having a private, stressful moment weaponized into a neighborhood warning. You saw a threat, she sees her family's vulnerable crisis turned into public spectacle. Apparently I dropped off a flyer in their mailbox, the family who I captured in 4K on my property. I, in somewhat of a panic now, ran back and was able to retrieve the other 3 out of 4 flyers I put in mailboxes. This family were the only ones who actually saw the flyer. She really made me feel like an a-hole when I was trying to just watch out for my neighbors' properties and safety. We have a history of vagrants roaming through our easements where they emerged from, mind you, and I really thought that was what happened today. We also don't live out in the country. This is in a metro area of Tucson, Arizona. Seeing an underwear man on your property, something anyone else would call the cops over. I'm honestly horrified and feel ashamed, but at the same time feel like I did the right thing. It's very conflicting. Wife thinks I shouldn't have made the flyers. I kind of agree, but 99.9% of the rest of the time, it wouldn't have been a false alarm. I may have started a neighbor feud. F my life. The flyers were probably a step too far, yeah, but her acting like you should have magically known what was happening is unfair. People don't normally recover chickens in their underwear at dawn on someone else's property. That's not normal behavior. You were trying to protect your home and your neighbors, not shame her family. And our second story. Her tight connection was everyone else's problem. The flight attendants made it hers when they gate-checked her bags. I was on my way home from a bachelorette party across the country last year, exhausted in that very specific way that only airports and too many celebratory cocktails can create. You know, the kind of tired where your social battery is dead, your feet hurt, and all you want is to get home, shower, and not talk to another human being for at least 12 hours. I had a layover before my final flight, and I was already mentally bracing myself for the usual airline chaos. Thankfully, my husband had upgraded my boarding group before I left for the trip. It was one of those small but incredibly thoughtful things that ends up saving your sanity. Because of that upgrade, I knew I'd be able to board early, get my carry-on into an overhead bin, and not have to deal with gate-checking my bag and then standing around at baggage claim at midnight. That carry-on had everything important in it: makeup, chargers, a change of clothes, and honestly, my last shred of patience. I was in either the first or second boarding group. Before they even started boarding, the gate agent came over the loudspeaker and announced that the flight was completely full. They asked for volunteers to gate check their bags. No incentive, no free drink vouchers, just a polite plea. Unsurprisingly, no one jumped up to volunteer. People suddenly became very attached to their carry-ons when they hear the words "fully booked." My group was called and I boarded without any issues. I found my seat, lifted my carry-on into the overhead compartment directly above my row, and noticed there were already 2 bags in there that looked like crew bags. When I added mine, the compartment was full, but it closed just fine. I sat down, buckled in, and tried to decompress. A few minutes later, the flight attendants came through and closed all the full overhead compartments, including the one above me. As more boarding groups came on, the flight attendants kept making announcements over and over again. They said that any overhead compartment that was closed was full and to keep moving to find an open one. By the time the final boarding group started coming on, I honestly couldn't see a single open bin anywhere near me. It was wall-to-wall people, bags, and irritation. That's when 2 women who I assumed were a mother and her adult daughter made their way down the aisle to my row. The older woman immediately opened the overhead compartment above me, even though it had been clearly closed. She looked inside, scoffed loudly, and said something along the lines of, "Our bags need to go here." Not asked, declared. Then she opened the overhead compartment across the aisle, scoffed again, and I think she opened at least one more before a flight attendant noticed and came over. The flight attendant politely but firmly told her that the closed compartments were full and needed to stay closed. She then had to go back and physically reclose every compartment this woman had just opened. Instead of accepting this information like a normal human, the woman immediately started arguing. She insisted that she needed her bags above her seat. The flight attendant calmly repeated that the compartment was full and she would need to find another spot. The daughter then walked farther down the aisle looking for space while the flight attendant turned briefly to help another passenger. Her tight connection wasn't an emergency, it was an excuse. She wasn't managing a crisis, she was using it as a license to bypass rules everyone else had to follow. And that's when it happened. The woman opened the overhead compartment above my seat again, grabbed my bag, and put it in the aisle. I'm not exaggerating. She physically removed my carry-on and dropped it into the walkway like it was trash she was discarding. The flight attendant spun around instantly and said very sharply, "You cannot do that, ma'am. You need to find another place for your bag." The woman launched into an explanation about how she had a tight connection and needed to get to the international terminal when we landed. Apparently, that made her entitled to other people's belongings. At this point, I was sitting there in disbelief. In my head, I was thinking, A, you could have paid the same $30 or whatever to upgrade your boarding group like I did, and B, if your connection was that tight, maybe you should have booked an earlier flight. We were flying into SFO, which is massive. Even without delays, making an international connection there's not a casual stroll. The daughter came back and said there were no more open compartments anywhere on the plane. The flight attendant nodded and said that in that case, they would need to gate check their bags. She put my bag back where it belonged and closed the compartment again like she'd already done multiple times. Then another flight attendant came over and suddenly this turned into a whole production. They were discussing gate check forms, international connections, bag transfers, and logistics. Meanwhile, the woman kept repeating that she could not gate check her bags. Over and over, the flight attendants kept explaining calmly, patiently, that there was no more room. It was the same conversation on a loop. All of this delayed the flight by at least 20 minutes. People were sighing, checking their watches, and shooting looks down the aisle. Eventually, reality won. The bags were gate-checked, forms were filled out. The woman was visibly furious. Oh, the irony. In her frantic rush to avoid gate-checking, she guaranteed her bags would be left behind. The very consequence she fought so hard to avoid was the one she created. And then, of course, I realized I was sitting next to them for the entire flight. The woman coughed constantly, sneezed without covering her mouth, and had a runny nose the whole time. I wiped down everything, put on my mask, and prayed. Somehow I didn't get sick. Before landing, the pilot made an announcement asking passengers with tight connections to raise their hands so others could let them off first. The woman raised her hand like she was claiming a prize. We landed, and it was absolute chaos. No one waited. Everyone who could stand up did. I just sat there, laughing to myself, knowing there was no way they were making that flight. And even if they did, their bags definitely weren't. I love how she kept repeating, "I can't gate check my bag," like saying it enough times would magically create space. The bins were full. That's it. End of story. You don't get to reopen closed compartments and start rearranging strangers' belongings like you're organizing your garage. Also, putting your bag in the aisle is wild behavior. I would have been livid, even exhausted. You handled it way calmer than most people would have. And our last story. Wild Karen harassed me for using the disability pass. I was at a theme park yesterday with a group of friends, expecting the usual long lines, overpriced food, and sore feet by the end of the day. Because of my leg, I planned ahead. I have a medical condition affecting my ankle bone. There's a proper name for it, but I don't know the English equivalent, and it caused permanent damage. Walking is possible, but slow. Standing for long periods is brutal, and getting in and out of rides takes extra time. Standing in tight queues all day is exactly how I end up in pain for days afterward, so we applied for the park's accessibility pass. The pass isn't a fast pass. You don't skip lines. You wait the same amount of time as everyone else, just in a separate queue with benches, wider spaces, and staff who can help with boarding. It exists so people with mobility issues don't have to choose between pain or missing out entirely. To get it, you don't have to show medical paperwork up front, though the terms say you can be asked to verify if needed. I wasn't worried about that. I wear a very obvious orthopedic boot, knee-high, bulky, not subtle, and most employees clock it immediately. I also had screenshots of my diagnosis saved just in case. Everything was going fine until we queued for one of the more popular rides. While we were waiting, I heard an exaggerated sigh behind us. A woman with a child was clearly unhappy with the length of the line. A few seconds later, she lit a cigarette right there. One of my friends who has asthma asked her politely if she could step back a bit. She did, but not before letting out a dramatic scoff and loudly announcing that we'd better make sure staff knew she was there so no one cuts. An employee came out to check passes before loading. He asked who had the accessibility pass in our group. I showed him mine, and he nodded and moved on. He checked hers as well, scanned it, and everything was fine. The moment he walked away, she leaned forward and asked me, "So what's your disability?" I pointed at my boot and said it was related to my leg. Her face immediately twisted. "That's not a disability," she said. "I mean, are you actually disabled?" I explained briefly that I have a permanent ankle condition and turned back around. That should have ended it. Instead, she started muttering, then raising her voice, accusing me of ignoring her, telling me I was rude, telling me I needed to respect my elders. People nearby were starting to watch. One of my friends finally turned around and told her it wasn't her business. He said she wouldn't like it if strangers interrogated her or her kid about medical conditions either. That's when she snapped back that her daughter was autistic, so she was actually disabled. The implication was clear. Her child's disability was real, mine was fake. She weaponized her child's diagnosis as a shield, using it to claim moral high ground while actively harassing someone else with an invisible and then visible disability. The hypocrisy wasn't a bug in her logic, it was the point. When the employee came back to load the next group, she immediately pointed at me and said loudly, "That boy isn't disabled at all. He shouldn't be in this line." I corrected her and said I was 28, not a boy, and yes, I was disabled. She ignored me and kept talking over everyone, demanding that staff remove me from the queue. The employee tried to explain that my pass was valid and already approved. She got louder, saying the park was being scammed, that people like me were abusing the system and that she was going to report all of us. At that point, another staff member came over, then a supervisor. They asked her to lower her voice and step aside so they could talk. She refused and shoved past one of them to get closer to me, pointing at my leg and saying, "You'll walk fine. You don't need help. You're lying." That's when security got involved. 2 security officers approached and asked what was going on. The supervisor explained that she was harassing another guest and disrupting the queue. Karen immediately switched tactics, claiming she was being discriminated against because of her autistic child and that I had threatened her. Several people in line spoke up at that point, saying they'd watched her interrogate me, shout at staff, and refuse to leave us alone. Security asked me if I wanted to make a complaint. I said yes. They asked her to step away from the ride area so they could review the situation. She refused again, started yelling that she knew her rights, and tried to grab my arm to prove I wasn't disabled. One of the guards blocked her, and that was apparently her final straw. She started screaming that she was being assaulted and that she was calling the police. Security beat her to it. The police arrived about 10 minutes later. They separated everyone and took statements. I wrote everything down for the officer who spoke to me, including the part where she tried to grab me. They reviewed CCTV footage from the queue, which showed her following me, pointing, shouting, and attempting to reach for me while security intervened. After that, the tone changed fast. The officers told her she was being detained for disorderly conduct and harassment, and that attempting to grab another guest could be considered assault. She lost it, full meltdown, crying, yelling, accusing the park of discrimination, accusing the police of targeting her. None of it helped. They cuffed her and walked her out while her kid cried and a staff member stayed with the child until another family member could be contacted. Her performance was meant for an audience of sympathizers, but the only audience left was the law. Every escalation was a choice, and she handed the consequences to herself wrapped in cuffs. The supervisor apologized to me repeatedly and comped our group food vouchers and ride photos. I didn't care about that. I just wanted the situation to be over. Later that evening, a park manager came to check in and confirmed that she'd been formally trespassed from the park and banned pending the outcome of her charges. I finally got to enjoy the rest of the day without being interrogated about my body by a stranger who thought she was the disability police. I went home tired, sore, and still a little shaken, but honestly relieved. I'm used to people questioning me. I'm not used to them being stopped and held accountable. That part felt good. All 3 stories are about the collision between private stress and public perception. In each, someone's personal crisis, lost chickens, a tight connection, a child needs, blinded them to how their actions affected others. The protagonists weren't villains, they were witnesses who reacted to the chaos in front of them. The real tension isn't about who was right initially, but about what happens when empathy fails in both directions. When one person sees a threat where there's a struggle, and the other sees hostility where there's concern. Which story would you give first place to? Write in the comments. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a new video every single day. Thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.